Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Danielle Chapman. Danielle is a lecturer at Yale University, a poet and memoirist, and today we're discussing her memoir, Holler, a Poet Among Patriots. This is genuinely, to me, a beautiful memoir that has numerous twists and turns interwoven with a lot of remarkable military and Southern history, Southern folklore, and some of the darkest nuances of American Southern history, and yet trying to find a way to tell stories that respect the human beings who play key roles in all of these stories. Truly a beautiful memoir. I love this conversation with Danielle. I hope you enjoy it. Hey friends, Lee here. If you enjoy our conversations at the intersection of faith, purpose, and living well, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King. With and For's latest season brings together psychology and spiritual wisdom in a way that feels thoughtful, grounded, deeply human, and it's hosted by my friend Dr. Pam King, a developmental psychologist and ordained minister who offers practical guidance towards a life of thriving. I'd recommend starting with their episode featuring Parker J. Palmer, world-renowned writer, speaker, activist, Quaker elder who focuses on issues in education, spirituality, and social change. A moving and instructive conversation. Can't recommend it enough. Also, check out With and For's special summer series of wisdom practices. Released each Monday, they're short exercises shared by guests that will become a toolkit for thriving. Consider them your experiment in becoming more fully alive. So go ahead, follow With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you're listening now.
This one goes out to all my ladies, all my multitasking mamas who need energy to show up at work and at home, all my empty nest explorers who need a little gut health support for the journey ahead. AG1 is the daily health drink designed to support whole body health with over 75 essential nutrients and pre- and probiotics, so you can make the most of every day and every decade. Learn more at drinkag1.com.
Did you know Sam's Club isn't a store? It's actually a club. With cool finds and like a whole community. It's a club.
Of course, Jason. It's in the name. Sam's Club.
Oh, yeah. Come join us. Sam's Club.
Danielle, welcome to No Small Endeavor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to have
Excited to be
you.
here.
Yeah, your memoir, Holler, a Poet Among Patriots. It's really deeply moving, and I found myself eager to continue to follow the storyline and hear where this was going to go. And it's lovely and it's beautiful, and I thank you for it. You say in the opening chapter, not the introduction, but the opening chapter, that by the time you were 5 or 6, you knew the story of your father's death and your mother's salvation by heart. Would you kind of recite that story for us as you recollected in your mind?
Yeah, well, in the book, the first chapter starts with the story as a kind of poem, I think, because I heard it often, but also because it's so intense. My mother and father were scuba diving. My father was a Marine who was stationed in Okinawa, and scuba diving was a regular activity. And typhoons are pretty regular in Okinawa. However, that's not actually what this was. It was while they were scuba diving, there was an earthquake, and it caused a small tsunami. They were with friends, and while in the midst of scuba diving, they basically became trapped not too far out from the shore. And I was there. I remember it amazingly. I mean, I was less than 3 years old, but I was with a babysitter and watched from shore as they just repeatedly were pushed underwater and came back up. And that happened many, many times. Every time a wave would come, they would go under and, just have to keep treading water because they couldn't get back to shore. And eventually my father we don't know exactly what happened, but whatever kind of riptide or whatever it was that pulled him under made it so that he couldn't get back up again. But my mother was able to keep treading and stayed alive.
You recount the way your mother framed that for you repeatedly through your early days she recounted Baptist hymns coming to her and then the kind of experience that she had of letting go.
Yes, she said that, when it first started, they realized something was wrong and they were holding hands. And, he every time they would come up to the top, they'd have to struggle to the top. And when they got to the top together, he would say, just keep holding hands. Just don't let go. Just get back to the top and breathe. And then at a certain point, his hand got ripped out of hers. And so she said at that point, she just kind of despaired and thought she wanted to die. And then she felt it as this sort of miraculous thing. She felt like she got buoyed up into the water, and she started hearing the hymns from childhood come back to her. She was actually Mennonite. Her family was from, they were immigrants from the Ukraine, as we call it now. And, but her parents had converted to or become Baptist in Canada. And so she was raised very, in a religious, conservative sort of environment, and had left that in her younger years. And in that moment, those hymns came back to her, and she described her limbs being kind of filled with light as she was lifted up on the water. And that was what she credited with keeping her alive.
Yeah, one detail that you share there in that opening page was that along with that experience that she had, that she sort of consciously made a decision that moving from despair and perhaps even wanting to die with your father, she turns and chooses to live, or is given this opportunity to live for you and with you as your mother. And I wonder, as you think back about that, you at some point used the language of being christened with that story. And you don't use the language that I remember of debt or obligation as such, but having been christened with that story. But nonetheless, christened is a strong, obviously sacramental language that there's some sort of gift there, and there's some sort of perhaps obligation or baptism into something. And how have you subsequently experienced that, being christened into that story? Or what's been your sense of obligation, if any, because of that story?
Yeah. I think that it's the supernatural intensity of the story hit me before I knew what it was. And, we have so much language now about trauma, but I don't think we really had that so much, almost 50 years ago or 40 some years ago when my mother was telling me this story. And so, as I was hearing it, I think on some level, what was being conveyed to me was just her life force, just the absolute fact that she had lived. And on some level, it was obviously this is an incredibly traumatizing experience. And so just her sheer survival, I think, was what was coming out. And yes, I do think that I feel and have always felt a huge responsibility and duty to life itself, maybe is the way to put it. I definitely, I'm not unaware of the burdensome side of having, as a child, having to carry that. But I think that ultimately it's a awareness more than anything of the fact that we don't necessarily have this. It's not something to be taken for granted. And I'm not entirely sure how that experience of both seeing my father die, but also hearing my mother tell the story influenced me becoming a poet. But I do think that part of it is likely just the hyper awareness to reality, to one's own perceptions and kind of the value of them in any instant of time.
So you mentioned there that your father was a Marine, and his father as well was not only a Marine, but the commandant of the Marines. And he becomes, in effect, your surrogate father?
Yes. It was quite there's another christening for you, a christening into sort of the deep broth of America that I was then plunged into. The book, I know that in many ways it's quite dense, because this story of my father dying is just the first chapter, and then it moves to the life that we then had after my father died. My mother made the decision, which, is kind of an unusual decision, but also, a fateful one, and a sort of, I don't know what I want to call it, a word. I was listening to a podcast with you, and you used the word winsome to describe, I think, the story of Christianity, of Jesus. That it's kind of a winsome choice. She decided to move in with my father's parents, even though she came from this very large family in Canada. She had 63 cousins.
Wow.
And instead we moved in with my father's parents, who were kind of retired military royalty there in outside of DC. But one big reason that she did it was because of my grandfather, because he was an extraordinary person. And the memory that I write about in that first chapter of him picking us up from Okinawa tries to capture, I remember this as well, him arriving in his uniform, the general, the 4-star general, just kind of coming to rescue us, and he'd just lost his son, but he sort of had this intrinsic ability to comfort other people. And, if I think about duty, nobody embodied that more than him. He took his duties so seriously. And one of the duties that he absolutely held sacred was taking care of his family. And not just his family, but actually anybody who was bereaved, that had been something that he had done as a Marine for so many people who had died.
Then another very significant strand of your storytelling arises out of Fairfield, Tennessee. How do you end up finding yourself in a little tiny village of Fairfield, Tennessee?
Yeah. So my grandfather, as a child, went to his mother's ancestral home, which was this house in Tennessee, which I still own. It was originally a tavern at the edge of the Western frontier. The family lore says that it was built in 1790, and that the back half of the house is still that tavern. And it has not changed much. It still has a lot of the furnishings in it. And you walk in there and it feels like a tavern. The high ceiling dining room and the parlor, and and not fancy. It's like I've read that in those times, these taverns, just held every type of traveler. So and they slept in an attic. So the attic is still there. And what I've read is that it didn't matter who you were. Everybody just slept next to each other on bedrolls, including livestock sometimes. So, and then the front half of the house is a farmhouse that was added on later. So he loved this place. He loved the history that was there. He'd been there as a child. I make a joke that we hadn't been allowed to move the furniture since the Confederacy fell. I mean, it was like a sort of mnemonic device for him. So you couldn't change anything because then he wouldn't be able to remember it, you know? So it's like this just kind of, everything conjures sometime in the past.
Yes, yeah.
So he brought me there and I guess indoctrinated me into that
and
love.
This kind of becomes a summer rhythm for you all?
Yes, I went there every summer as a child, and we would stay for almost the whole summer, or 6 weeks, 2 months.
Yeah. Huh. I love your phrase that, and it's fascinating to me to think about, and this is a detail that you've already shared that's not in the book, but it's a fascinating contrast to think about. You have on your mother's side former Mennonites who obviously have a very long peace tradition, critiques of war, and then you have you're brought into your grandfather on your father's side life, what you call it, the broth of America, the thick broth of America. When did you begin to have sorts of questions or reservations or doubts about the militarism or that broth of America which your papa represented?
My first really strong memory of awakening is 7th grade civics. I had a teacher, Mr. Bedford, who was a former hippie, like a fire-breathing hippie with long white hair. And he was so passionate, and he would, he'd throw his arms up and, inveigh about the moral war crimes of America. And, and I would argue with him. I would just I would get really into it and kind of parrot the things that I'd unconsciously heard, from my grandfather or from whatever, just that broth. And he would come back at me and say, are you even listening to what you're saying? And and then he would lay out the facts. And that was a shock, because I think it's what a lot of Americans experience when they go abroad for the first time. And you think, oh my gosh, like, people don't like us. There's like, maybe we're not so great. We're not like the best people in the whole wide world. And, just that, I guess part of the broth had been American exceptionalism. I just had no idea that these things about how heroic we were and how good might not be true. I mean, ironically, I then sort of full scale converted and rebelled, and then I think lost sight of the fact that in some ways, we are good, or some like it's mixed. It's not. But I think both sides are kind of their own fundamentalism,
Yeah. And I want to explore that that ambivalence that you play out in various ways here in a moment, along with becoming aware of at least the ambiguities or the complexities there. You also began to show the ways in which your awareness of race in American history begins to be a very important part in your early childhood story. What's your earliest memories of when you begin to wonder, or begin to have questions, or see things that cause you to stand aside and begin to ask follow-up questions?
Yeah, that is somewhat mysterious to me, because it seems almost like it was intrinsic. A kind of awareness of just the inequality of race seems to me to almost have been there from the beginning. But I have a very early memory of my grandfather telling me the story of George Singleton, which is in, the basis of the last chapter of my book, which was about a man who had been enslaved at the farm and ended up, it's an incredible story and very complicated, but he ended up fighting for the Union Army and coming back to Tennessee. And so my grandfather knew him when he was a child, and he spoke of him with just complete reverence, but without any, without what you'd maybe expect, which would be guilt or some kind of compunction about the fact that his family had held slaves. And I think I just felt a dissonance there between his reverence for this man and the fact of slavery. I must have had enough ambient noise or atmosphere from Northern Virginia, where I grew up, to, at least know how bad slavery was, and that it was this huge mark on our national psyche. So that dissonance was there from the beginning for me. But also I grew up in Northern Virginia, which is a very diverse place. And we lived in a townhouse complex that was quite diverse. And, therefore there was a lot of the jostling that happens in a genuinely, I say multicultural, or I didn't say multicultural, I said diverse. That's more accurate because, it wasn't kumbaya. It was, just a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And, kids notice each other's differences. So there's a lot of talk about race, in elementary school.
So then what, as you're going to Fairfield, Tennessee as a young girl, there are also these caretakers on site. How do they factor into what you're seeing and what you're learning?
That was another, oh gosh, it's just that so many layers there, because on one level, there's the layer of race and of class. They lived, so their names were James and Ella. They were just such an important part of my childhood. We would go down there, and they lived in the little house. That's what we called it, but it was it was formerly the kitchen. So in these Southern houses, they at some point often took the kitchen off the house and moved it over the side to prevent fires. So it was essentially a shack. They lived in this little shack over to the side of the larger house. And, they were, as my grandfather described them, the salt of the earth. James had been through 6th grade and Ella through 8th, and they'd met at a fair. This is, one of my favorite stories. He was carrying a brown bag of whiskey, and he said to her, "Follow me, chicken. I'm full of corn." And she said, "I've been following him ever since." And that was kind of their story. They had, she had no teeth. He had maybe 3 or 4 teeth. It was really, they'd never been out of the county. And Ella in particular was deeply racist. Huh. Just things that she would say things that made your hair stand on end. And at the same time, and obviously they were very poor, and they loved me probably more ferociously than anybody else I've ever known, and I loved them, and so that became another real struggle and quarrel for me in my heart, is to understand how these things can coexist in a person and what it means, because the story among, quote unquote, aristocratic Southerners throughout time is just to dismiss that type of racism as a kind of low class, ignorance. And of course that, it is partly ignorance, but that is another type, that's classism speaking to that. It's a way of dismissing the person and not seeing them as an equal, so it's a hedging of sorts. That's a long answer, but
no, very helpful. And that's a great segue into kind of one of the things, another thread that's running throughout your storytelling is that, and you've already alluded to this a couple of times, of this sort of ambivalence of when you go on to talk about trying to understand your grandfather's experiences and your grandmother's experiences with World War II, then your grandfather's experience with Vietnam and your own father's experience in Vietnam, you're trying to give us a glimpse of their subjectivity, their pain, and we might say the logic of their hatred, and even some of the racism that comes out, while refusing simply to accept it. So I don't know, kind of help us unpack some of that, and maybe especially as you continue to ask questions about World War II and Vietnam. How are you seeing that there are these two things that you're wanting to try to hold together at the same time?
Yeah, I think it started because of this dynamic that I described a minute ago about, as soon as I sort of awoke to the fact that we as Americans, as white Americans, had committed, wrongs, had committed sins and evils, I just sort of flipped to the other side. In a very adolescent way, where you sort of want to take the higher ground. And as I came, and I am still a liberal, but I think at a certain point I started to see that liberalism isn't necessarily compassionate in every situation. And I started when I really was looking at my family members and looking at their experiences, I realized I couldn't evaluate them as humans without trying to understand what they'd experienced. I mean, it's just incredibly complex. With World War II, for example, both of my grandparents were in Pearl Harbor. They were at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. My grandfather was on a ship. My grandmother was watching from an apartment, and she didn't know for 3 days whether or not he'd lived. And so this woman who, as I knew her, she'd been very hurt and damaged by the wars, in my mind, by American history on some level. American history kind of rinsed through her and wore her down, as well as her own take on it, presented, I think, some psychological difficulties there. But this woman who, for me, was, very compromised in the end by so much of what she had gone through, had been at Pearl Harbor, and in those 3 days in which her husband had been missing, she had rolled bandages for the Red Cross. She'd like gone through the fence and pulled people out who were wounded. And so just, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more that I learned, the more facts that I learned by doing some research, by talking to people, the more difficult it was to have a sort of ideological point of view about some of this stuff.
Hey friends, Lee here. If you enjoy our conversations at the intersection of faith, purpose, and living well, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King. With and For's latest season brings together psychology and spiritual wisdom in a way that feels thoughtful, grounded, deeply human, and it's hosted by my friend Dr. Pam King, a developmental psychologist and ordained minister who offers practical guidance towards a life of thriving. I'd recommend starting with their episode featuring Parker J. Palmer, world-renowned writer, speaker, activist, Quaker elder who focuses on issues in education, spirituality, and social change. A moving and instructive conversation. Can't recommend it enough. Also, check out With and For's special summer series of wisdom practices. Released each Monday, they're short exercises shared by guests that will become a toolkit for thriving. Consider them your experiment in becoming more fully alive. So go ahead, follow With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you're listening now.
This one goes out to all my ladies, all my multitasking mamas who need energy to show up at work and at home, all my empty nest explorers who need a little gut health support for the journey ahead. AG1 is the daily health drink designed to support whole body health with over 75 essential nutrients and pre- and probiotics, so you can make the most of every day and every decade. Learn more at drinkag1.com.
Everyone carries both profound experiences and untold stories worth exploring. Who is your greatest love, and why did you fall in love with them?
My greatest love was a man I met when I was 25 years old. And the minute I saw him, I somehow knew that it was the love of my life.
Hi, I'm Hunter Prosper, and on my podcast, Stories from a Stranger, I believe in approaching strangers with genuine curiosity. Listen to Stories from a Stranger wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, one anecdote you share is of catching your grandfather using a racial slur towards the Japanese. And you had simultaneously this visceral, self-righteous condemnation of what you caught him doing. And yet at the same time feeling uneasy about that, or a Pyrrhic victory, I think you call it. But what do you remember about that episode, and what was going through your mind and your experience?
Yeah, well, the chapter about World War II starts with a war hero from Tennessee named Austin Schaffner, General Austin Schaffner. He's a real character, especially in Shelbyville. He's got his own historical marker there by the insurance agency. And when I was a child, we would go and visit him, and it would be like we were visiting the war hero, and he had been in at the Battle of Corregidor, and he had been in a Japanese war camp or a prison camp, and it was a notorious one. And I actually it was called Davao, and the Davao prison camp in the Philippines. And so as a child, we would go out for Sunday brunch, and he would regale us with these war stories of him breaking out of the prison camp. And they and in the process of telling these stories, a lot of racial slurs are flying, because the Japanese were his mortal enemies, and they had tortured him and starved him. And, anyway, it would be kind of like this fire hose of war stories coming at us. And that was one thing my grandfather never did. He never told war stories. He hated war stories. And so after these lunches, I would just be appalled. And, and on the way home, just kind of be complaining. And then he would scold me, saying, I didn't appreciate the sacrifice of, these national figures who'd sacrifice for my liberty. And I would go at him, and I would just try to get, from a point of view of a liberal in the 70s and 80s and 90s, like, what about the Japanese? And, just giving the point of view of my generation, which was much more about the atom bomb and the evils that America committed in the war. And, this much more left point of view. That's sort of what I would be coming at him with. And while complaining about old Schaff, as we called him. And eventually my grandfather just kind of snapped. He never talked about his own war experience at all, but he had fought in the Pacific for the entire war. He'd been an artillery commander, and he'd seen so many people die. And he was not able to talk about it. He never spoke about trauma. That was not something that was talked about. And finally, he just said, well, you know why Schaff uses that word? It's because the Japanese tortured him, they beat him, they starved him, and that's why he uses that word. And he said it. I'm not saying it now, but he said it, and it was like I got him to say it, and say it angrily, and it was as if I had just all this time been trying to prove you really are a racist, but I guess, and that's the whole point. That's what I've been trying to prove. You're a racist, and that's who you are. That is the absolute essence of who you are. That was sort of the point of view that I had. And in some ways we have that now in wokeness and cancel culture. Like if somebody has done something racist, that's the only thing that matters about you. And that's sort of what I was trying to bring out. And so I felt this moment like I'd won. Oh, he proved it. He said it. So he's a racist, and that's all that matters. But that the reason I guess I called it a Pyrrhic victory is, what do I get out of that for one thing, but also, I think what I say in the chapter is I contemplated what it must have taken for him to sit there and listen to me, this completely privileged girl who has fought and, has had very little to sacrifice, has grown up with, it's not that we were rich, but we certainly weren't sacrificing every day. I showed, I think, just a lot of ignorance by reducing the matter to such a fine point. But he was patient to some degree.
Yeah. You discovered later then that while he was commandant of the Marines, that he was at the center of a great deal of furor because he had either put in place or practiced some policies to preserve some racial equality.
Yes, this just stunned me because the sort of theme of our arguments throughout my teenage years and adolescence were mostly about race. I would inveigh against racial inequality and particularly, institutional racism. And he would he'd take the line of, personal responsibility, that kind of idea. And, in retrospect, a sort of Marine-like idea of anybody can get ahead. We should be colorblind. I think that was sort of what he was conveying. But, we always argued about it. And he would sometimes get very upset with me. I would get very upset with him. And when he died, an obituary came out in the New York Times, and one of the main points of it was the work that he had done for racial justice in the Marine Corps. And he'd never talked about that. It was absolutely stunning. And eventually I went to the Marine Corps Library in Quantico and read through his archives. He has a set of papers there. And it turned out that the main controversy of his tenure as commandant was something called the Afro haircut controversy. And it was because he had made it, he'd allowed Marines to wear their hair Black Marines to wear their hair in a modified Afro. Or to do the Black Power salute to each other. And this was at a time in the 70s of extreme racial unrest. There were riots. There had been a riot among Marines, Black and white Marines. And so this was an attempt on his part to quell racial anxieties. And as far as I can tell, it was effective. But all of I think that there are 30 some boxes of letters of hate mail, all from irate white people who are disgusted that he has catered to Black Marines. And there's one news article where he says that it was very important to get Black music on the jukeboxes. That was something else that he did. And he says, and that was very important to my Black Marines. So I did it. And that absolutely inflamed people. I think that's very interesting because in a way it sounds paternalistic, and you can see how people could be offended from both sides. But I think that kind of embodies how he was. He felt he cared. He cared about the Black Marines, and this kind of translated, I believe, I mean, he never said so explicitly, but it's got to be that this translates from his childhood, his reverence for George Singleton, his love of that family. And, you know, it filtered through his point of view, but basically he just cared. But he got so much blowback for it that I can only imagine that is why he didn't talk about it afterwards. It felt to him maybe like it wasn't successful.
So his not talking there about that particular episode also, though, seems consistent with his not talking about feelings or emotions that you also unpack in various ways through the book. But give us kind of a glimpse of what that was like, both for your grandfather and your grandmother.
Well, sometimes it was funny, you know, he liked to say, "Oh, Danny, you know, I don't have feelings." I try to, when whatever we were talking about, I'd try to just kind of pull it out of him. I just wanted a little more, you know, in retrospect, it's probably, you know, I didn't have my father. I just, you know, was searching for reactions and, a kind of emotive quality, and I was just but the way that I would try to get it out of him was by asking him about his own experience, and he would say, "Oh, Danny, I don't have feelings." You know, that was often if I was trying to ask him about things about the war that particularly that was something in particular he didn't want to talk about. My grandmother was a different story. We didn't know this until after she had passed away, but she was a Southern debutante, a Southern lady. She introduced herself as Emily Donaldson Walton Ford Chapman Jr., you know, the descendant of the Huguenots who discovered Nashville, you know, so that was the kind of Southern lady she was. But throughout my childhood, she was incredibly quiet and very, very strange. And I didn't know why. And we were always analyzing her. My mother and I were always these odd little things that she would do. We would try to analyze. And it turned out that she had been diagnosed. She'd had a nervous breakdown right at the end of my grandfather's time as commandant, on the way to the Munich Olympics. And she had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had been on heavy duty tranquilizers throughout my entire childhood. So that was this incredible silence that just, you know, it was a medically induced silence, really. And I've done a little bit of research into this, and apparently PTSD can really mimic schizophrenia. They think that often there's a misdiagnosis there. And certainly at that time, military doctors would have been motivated to quiet a sort of what they would have called a hysterical woman down. They didn't want that was not within their ken. And so I think she was probably misdiagnosed and had very bad PTSD.
Do you remember your grandfather weeping or crying when he was flying you back from Okinawa at the death of his son?
No, he didn't. Not at all. And actually, my uncle, there's a family story, you know, that has a bit of an edge to it, in which my uncle said that at my grandfather's funeral, he was very upset by the fact that he was the only one crying. Note that my grandfather and my grandmother stood at attention, you know, in the military pose, and did not weep. I'm sure my grandmother was very heavily medicated, but my grandfather did not cry. And I never heard him cry about my father. And also, he was not able to talk about my father. The only thing he would say was he was basically that he was the most wonderful man. I couldn't have had a more wonderful son. He was a wonderful Marine, kind of a golden child. That was how he was portrayed. He couldn't express his own grief, definitely.
How did that example of processing, or one might say not processing grief, impact your own ability or inability to grieve?
Yeah, that's a hard one I'm thinking about a lot lately. I as I mentioned to you before we came on, I was just up at a memorial service for my uncle Walt. It was really wonderful, and it reminded me just how incredibly important it is to grieve. Of course, we all know this in our psychologized culture. Doing it is another matter, though. I admit that I find grieving difficult. I tend to have incredibly intense emotions that are buried very deeply. And I think that's another reason that I'm a poet. This kind of intensity and extremity is definitely there, but it requires a lot of doing to get there. Sometimes a very intricate, complicated sort of coat hanger device has to be fashioned in order to, that's not a felicitous metaphor, but, it's difficult often for me to discover what I feel. Often in a poem, oddly enough, is what allows it to come out. However, when my grandfather died, my grief was very present. And I guess I would say that when I do feel grief, I experience it as a blessing. It feels to me so needed, and it connects you to the people who are gone or who are ill, or, who you love. And so I think part of my path is learning to allow myself to feel it, to finding the places where I can, so that I can connect. So many of the people who I love so much are gone. I'm very aware of that. It's funny because my mother had 65 cousins, but I'm an only child and an only grandchild on both sides. So so many of the people who I've loved are gone. And so that, I guess that's another plug for poetry, is that it's the art form that kind of seeks wildly to make a little piercing through to the other side, to the eternal. But simple grief, I think, does the same thing. It makes you remember.
Yeah. So on that question about poetry and role or vocation as a poet, I would love to dig into a little bit more about what's the poet seeking to do in conjuring such stories, or conjuring these kind of memories. And at one point you say, why remember? Why dredge things up? Why go into all that again? And then you go on to say, because I believe in my memories as if they were articles of faith, that they rivet me for a reason, that if tested rigorously enough, they will yield some meaning bigger than themselves, and maybe even the truth. Would you unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah. So, this probably speaks a little bit to the subtitle of the book. It's Holler, a Poet Among Patriots. And, that term holler kind of is a bit multivalent, because it's, a holler in the South is, that place on the riverbank that you're not supposed to go. That's where we knock the croquet balls if we wanted to be really mean. And it's, I wasn't allowed to go there alone. So on some place, it's the tangled area that holds the darkness and holds the secrets. But of course, it's also a primal yell, and it's also kind of a marine sound. I think, I'm not sure they call it hollering, but that ooh-rah thing that Marines do. I think that I called it Holler, a Poet Among Patriots, because on some level, I think of being a poet as antithetical to being a Marine or a patriot, in that I think of that as being invested with so much stoicism, and whereas being a poet is, as Wordsworth said, emotion recollected in tranquility. It's an emotional endeavor, which I'm sure is why I was always trying to get my grandfather to give me some feelings. And of course, feeling is the necessary element for all art, I think. But so there's this kind of push and pull between being a poet and being this military, a military, coming from a military family, but also, I guess, just with the silences, there's a belief that maybe it's what every writer feels when they're dealing with family sort of secrets or silences, that it's better to leave it alone. You don't want to uncover something that you might not be able to handle, which reminds me suddenly of that Marine movie, A Few Good Men.
You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Is that the meaning of the very last sentence of your book?
Let me look.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You want to maybe unpack what you're doing there in that last paragraph or two?
Yeah.
Or the story behind it, which is it's troubling, right? Because you are touching, and we'll unpack the story a bit more, the preface to the story a bit more in a moment, but you're looking at literally a slave trader's journal who was your triple great grandfather's father-in-law. And you're looking at the records of his having traded human beings. And you're realizing the pain and I think you used the word evil of that you have in your hand. And yet there's also this sort of ambivalence about how much of this do we want to continue to recover? But I don't know. I'd be fascinated to hear you comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'm still figuring out what I meant by this. Not only in a writerly way, but I think America is still really trying to figure this out. This part right at the end, I'm actually holding this journal that I found, which in some ways is a discovery of another part of the family history, even though the story of George and Robert Singleton is a story out of slavery. It was presented and has been accepted by both the Black and the white descendants as a positive story, a story of love and friendship and forgiveness. And these reunions that we have come out of that, and they're incredibly special. I mean, it is a miracle of just human connection that this happens.
And just to make clear for listeners here, these are reunions between your family lineage, going back to this great grandfather, and then the lineage of those who were enslaved by your great grandfather. And you all have been coming together there at this old tavern that you now own. Many years later.
Right. And that's, they're the descendants of the man who I mentioned, George Singleton, who my grandfather told me about when I was very small, who he'd known when he was a boy. And he had been enslaved himself. The kind of outline of the story is that Robert and George Singleton were born in the same year. Robert Singleton was my great-great-grandfather. He and George were both born in 1842. And as my grandfather told it, they grew up as boys did back then, just playing together. It was a small farm. I mean, this is not a plantation, so it's, and it's in a border state. So,
and George is enslaved, or
oh yes.
Yeah.
George is enslaved, and his father Jack had come from Virginia, and so there were I'm not sure exactly how many, maybe 10 people enslaved at the farm at the time, and it would have been a more sort of casual, you might say, relationship between the races than what we're used to seeing if you see a plantation story, which meant that things were a little less regimented in terms of how authoritarian things were between the races. So, for instance, people who were enslaved often were blacksmiths who traveled around to different farms, this kind of thing. However, when they were about 18, the Civil War started, and my ancestor went off to fight for the Confederacy. And there was a letter that was during my childhood, it was framed and hung on the wall, in which he asks his mother, he's at the Battle of Stones River, and he asks his mother to send George to help. And so George does go as kind of his manservant. And at the Battle of Stones River, my ancestor got his leg shot off, and George went out onto the battlefield, and the legend goes, dragged him off of the battlefield and saved his life, took him to a Union medic tent. And he went back to recuperate. And at that point, George was free. He left and went to fight for the Union Army. He fought in the Union Army, was discharged, at the end of the war. At that point, he was free, but he came back to Fairfield, and he got married, and he stayed there. And the white family, I left out an important part, which was that when he got back, the white family was destitute because all the women had been left, all the Confederate currency was devalued. They were dead broke. And so he planted a plot of seed and essentially got the family back up on their feet and helped them survive. And so in thanks, after the war, they helped him buy a piece of land. And essentially he stayed there. He was pretty successful, as successful as one could be during Reconstruction, as successful as you could be if you were Black. And he, just all sorts of interesting details. He came back from the war with a gun. He carried a gun. He registered to vote. He not only bought his own farm, but he bought several pieces of land, which he hired people out to work. So he was pretty successful there. And his family a lot of his family has stayed in the area. I know it's a long story, but it's the only thing that can explain why this could possibly happen, which is that about 25 years ago, essentially the Black family inherited the same story as the white family. So about 25 years ago, his ancestors got in touch with my grandfather, and my grandfather said basically like, come on over. And, and they had a reunion, and it's been happening ever since. So there's a big camp out at the property every summer, and, people come from all over, and it's essentially a family reunion of their family, because ours has dwindled down to mostly just me. And so it's a family reunion, but also a time that we talk about this history and try to make sense of it. It's an evolving situation. that took me a long time to get there, but back to that part at the end of my book. So when I say who would forget, when I'm talking about this much darker emblem of slavery in America, which is this journal that we found, it was just shoved in a desk, and it was the slave ledger of John Scott, who was my quadruple great grandfather. And it's essentially just his farm journal in which all of these enslaved people are listed, in the way that was done. And it's a reminder of just the callousness of what slavery was. There's this conversation happening now. I mean, it's not really a conversation, this ridiculous polemic that, is happening in which some people are trying to say slavery wasn't that bad. We shouldn't talk about it. We should just talk about George Washington and the apple tree or cherry tree, whatever. But these artifacts vibrate with the genuine evil that was committed. And so, that is something that I have to reckon with. Like, how can it's not just in terms of what the white family thinks, honestly, I'm a little less worried about that. Like, I don't mind putting these facts out there that acknowledge the sins that my ancestors committed. I mean, it's just true. You can't look at that and deny it. But the question for me is, how does that coexist with this beautiful story of, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness cannot put it out. Somehow these things happened at the same time.
Yeah, you at one point in grappling with that story, near the end of the book, you talk about the stereotypical academic way, liberal academic way of reading that story would be to tell the story of George Singleton as someone who had so internalized the mechanisms of slavery that he could never free himself from that and continues to submit himself to his oppressor. Mm-hmm. And yet you go on to say that one of your hesitations about such a framing of that story is that it fails to honor the lived realities and subjectivities of the Black descendants of that man in your own day.
Yeah, I think it's demeaning to them. And I mean, that's been said outright to me by certain people. And it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't account for the texture of history and of certain lives and of details like what I mentioned before, which is, that he came back from the war. He had agency, and what he chose to do with it was to buy a parcel of seed, plant the land, help out, the white family, but also establish his own family, get a house, raise 12 kids, vote. His father, who had come from Virginia, so had been enslaved his entire life, he registered to vote. He bought his own land. He and then and they bought more land. They employed other people. So one thing that there's a gentleman named Elwood MacMahon, who's sort of one of the patriarchs of the Singleton descendants, and one thing he's very proud of is that when George and Barbara died, there was an auction of the furniture in their house. And, white people came from all over the place to try to buy that furniture, like not just white people, but, like they had a nice house. Like they did well for themselves. And you can just imagine how incredibly difficult that was. And I think that, just in historical terms, that's Reconstruction and the ways that Black Americans made this country during Reconstruction chose to do that, rather than, seek revenge in every instance, but instead tried to make their own life in America. That's one part of history that we know very little about.
Well, as we move toward a close, I'm wondering if you would reflect a bit on, given the turmoil that you narrate in the story, your own inner turmoil, your family's turmoil, repressed experiences that come out in painful ways, allowing us to see all of that kind of turmoil throughout the narrative of your memoir. I'm wondering, have you come to know a serenity or a peace about some of those things out of that process of writing or out of other life's experiences? What's that been like for you?
I do seem to feel a little more peaceful, I have to admit. I think that comes from the McMahons and Singletons and just from spending as much time with them as I have over the years, because they're just so wonderful. I mean, they're just such loving people. And beyond that, there's a kind of supernatural grace that seems to arrive at the house when these things happen. Often we have somebody new arrive and they'll come and see what's going on and they'll just be flabbergasted. Like, what is going on here? This is just, I can't believe this, and just the forgiveness, the joy, the simple desire for community is just so palpable. I think it's probably the most embodied experience I've ever had of anything like the Holy Spirit or just supernatural love, kind of between people. I can't really shake it, no matter how, no matter how much analytical criticism I try to turn on the situation. That uplift is palpable, and it's not from me. It's from, I just think, all the accumulated experience and hope really that has somehow been around that place for centuries.
Been talking to Danielle Chapman about her recent memoir, Holler, Poet Among Patriots. Danielle, thank you for the beautiful memoir and the beautiful time we got to spend with you today.
Thank you so much for your time and for reading it and for your point of view, which is just delves right in there. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Hey friends, Lee here. If you enjoy our conversations at the intersection of faith, purpose, and living well, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King. With and For's latest season brings together psychology and spiritual wisdom in a way that feels thoughtful, grounded, deeply human, and it's hosted by my friend Dr. Pam King, a developmental psychologist and ordained minister who offers practical guidance towards a life of thriving. I'd recommend starting with their episode featuring Parker J. Palmer, world-renowned writer, speaker, activist, Quaker elder who focuses on issues in education, spirituality, and social change. A moving and instructive conversation. Can't recommend it enough. Also, check out With and For's special summer series of wisdom practices. Released each Monday, they're short exercises shared by guests that will become a toolkit for thriving. Consider them your experiment in becoming more fully alive. So go ahead, follow With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you're listening now.
This one goes out to all my ladies, all my multitasking mamas who need energy to show up at work and at home, all my empty nest explorers who need a little gut health support for the journey ahead. AG1 is the daily health drink designed to support whole body health with over 75 essential nutrients and pre- and probiotics, so you can make the most of every day and every decade. Learn more at drinkag1.com.
Everyone carries both profound experiences and untold stories worth exploring. Who is your greatest love, and why did you fall in love with them?
My greatest love was a man I met when I was 25 years old. And the minute I saw him, I somehow knew that he was the love of my life.
Hi, I'm Hunter Prosper, and on my podcast, Stories from a Stranger, I believe in approaching strangers with genuine curiosity. Listen to Stories from a Stranger wherever you get your podcasts.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.